To be here this morning and to continue and great to be in this place this morning. Once again, I'm going to wait for this weekend and set time apart and to just be together and also think about some key things for our lives from God's Word. So a few years ago, when I was, both of my kids played hockey when they were growing up. And, both played hockey on teams that would travel around and stuff, my son and daughter both. And one Sunday afternoon, I was doing what I spent a whole lot of my time doing for several years of my life, and that was I was hanging out in a hockey rink. My kids would, when the team, always have to be there an hour before the game. And so when you're parents, you drive the kid, get them to the game, and they go and join the team in the dressing room, and then you have time to kill. And so there's all kinds of things you do to kind of kill time. This one particular day, I was just standing around in the foyer of a hockey rink in Markham. And I was standing there and just kind of looking around and reading stuff on the bulletin board. And then I noticed over to my right, it was just like that, there were some doors. And there were two doors, just like that. But the doors were those doors where, they had a little slot of glass where you could sort of see through. And I was standing there looking, and I looked, and I could see something was going on in there. So, well, I got time to kill, let's go see what's going on. So I go through the doors, and when I came through these doors, I opened the doors, and it opened onto this huge indoor soccer field. And so I come in, and there in front of me is this big indoor soccer field, with fake grass and high roof. And sure enough, on the field were a bunch of kids playing soccer and just practicing. And so I came in and I started to watch what was going on. And I looked, and right there in front of me was this kid, and he was dribbling the soccer ball, and he had a coach with him, and the kid would kind of kick the ball, and then he would kind of walk over to it like this, and then he kicked it a little bit further, and then he kind of walk over to it like this, and I watched him do this a couple of times, and I kind of thought to myself, he's kind of a lazy kid, Not really too charged up about all of this. And then I looked across the field, and there was this group of girls, and they were with these little orange pylons had been arranged. And so the girls were supposed to kind of dribble the ball, sort of through the pylons. And I would watch them do that, and they were kind of doing it, but I was also watching, they were kind of poking at each other, and they were laughing and kind of fooling around, and I was thinking to myself, this is about the worst soccer team I've ever seen in my life. And then over here was a kid who had his back to me, and there was a coach who was maybe 10 yards away from him, and the coach had us the ball, and the coach gently, not hard, gently kicked the ball to the kid. And I watched the ball roll, and the kid just stood there. And the ball rolled right past me. And I'm thinking, man, I wouldn't bet on these guys for anything. And so the ball rolls past the kid, and he turns to go and get the ball. And when the kid turns to get the ball, I see in his face the unmistakable look of a child with Down syndrome. And I watch him as he walks over and gets the ball. And then all of a sudden I retrace my steps, and I go and I look at my buddy over here who's still slowly making his way down the sideline. And I take a better look at him, and I realize the same thing. And then I just take another second, and I look across at the girls. And this time I look a little harder, and I see that group of girls. And the same thing. They're young girls who clearly have some challenges, physical challenges in their life. And all of a sudden, that scene completely changed for me. It went from me thinking for a second, like, these guys are the worst soccer players I've ever seen in my life, to all of a sudden I realized I was looking at a field full of heroes. A field full of young kids who had been dealt a bit of a shorthand in life, perhaps, but who were there, making the best of it, who were there playing soccer despite some of the challenges that they faced in life. And all of a sudden, I realized that what I thought I was seeing, i.e. a terrible soccer team, was not the case at all. On the surface, on one level, that's what it looked like was happening. It looked like the story was about this terrible soccer team, but really that wasn't the story at all. It was a whole other thing was happening in front of me. And I realized that what I once thought was true, what I once thought was real, was turned upside down. And the way I thought things were not the way that they were at all. In this story that we just read this morning, that Ted read for us from the Gospel of John, that's what Jesus does. Jesus turns things upside down. In this story, Jesus calls us to think about the world in a completely different way. He calls us to stop seeing the way the world should work or the way the story seems to be playing itself out. And he calls us to look and to understand that there's a different way of living in this world, a different way of understanding how the world works. And this has implications for our lives and certainly for our family's life. It's a story that calls us to live our lives in a certain way. And it's a way that may be different than the way that the world tells us is the way to live. Jesus' teaching here, Jesus' example, what Jesus calls us to, is to a life of servanthood. A life of giving ourselves up for the good of others. And that's not always the story that we're told. That's not the story that we're often told is the way that the world really works best for you. But that's the way that Jesus tells us that the world works. And this, of course, has great implications for family. Not just about how we live our lives when we're out there, but how we live our lives when we're right there at home, living with one another as family. And so I just want to look at this story just a little bit this morning and offer to us some of the ideas that I think come from this story and see about how they then can change and affect our life together as a family. Now just notice, if you have your Bible there, in verse 1, it says, it was just about the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So this act, this commitment for Jesus offers of service to his disciples, that we need to understand it's rooted in his love for them. Jesus offers this act of servanthood to them because of his great and deep love. And so when we are invited to follow Jesus in a life of serving one another, the root of serving one another is like Jesus, it flows out of a heart of love and a desire to show love to those who were around, and again, even into the life of our family. And so a few things then that this text reminds us of or calls us to. The first thing that I think it teaches us is that serving, when we serve others, it causes us to elevate others. Serving is an act of elevating those around us. So we read that as the evening meal progresses, that Jesus does something very radical. It says that Jesus knew that the Father put all things under him, under his power, and that he'd come from God and he was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, let's quit. So, in that context, I know that's a bit of a weird thing for us because we don't usually, washing feet is not something that, well, it's not something we do in my house. I don't know about your house. I shouldn't make assumptions. But, probably for most of us, foot washing is not a cultural reality for most of us, right? But in the ancient culture, in the 1st century, this was a common act. It was an act of hospitality. It was an act that in most houses, when you entered into a home, you would have your feet washed. They would be dirty from the dusty roads and the kind of footwear that they had in the ancient day. And so foot washing was just a way to show hospitality, to show actually a sense of sort of deference to your guests. So what Jesus does here in a certain sense is not anything unusual in the ancient world. The washing of feet was a common practice of hospitality and welcome given to a guest. But who in the ancient world was usually responsible for foot washing? Does anyone know? I'll throw that out. Who would, in a household, who might be responsible? Yeah, the slave, right? That's it. It was a slave's job. And slaves were common. Anyone who had a little bit of means, even poor people in the ancient world in certain cases, had slaves for different reasons. Slave ownership was a normal part of ancient culture. And that was the slave's job. If you came into someone's house, your feet would be washed, and they would be washed by that household slave. Now, if someone didn't have a slave, who would be responsible to wash the feet? Who might be the next person, one step up maybe on the totem pole? Well, likely it might have been one of the children. Because children, sorry kids, in the ancient world weren't really that valued. I mean, they loved them, they knew they were important, but they would be important someday when they grew up. When they were little, not so much. But, so maybe the child would do the foot washing because they were lower down. They weren't considered as significant. So here we have it. I don't know, the story doesn't tell us, the text doesn't tell us. For whatever reason, there was probably no slave here in the room where the disciples and Jesus are gathering for their Last Supper together, because this story takes place on the night before Jesus is crucified. And so there's no slave in the place, there's no servant in the place, no kids in the place, I guess. And in that context of that upper room, who was probably the last person who should be washing feet that night? Jesus. Yeah, Jesus, right? Because why? Because he's Jesus? No, because he was the rabbi. He was the teacher. He was the leader of the group. So in the social structure, if there was Jesus and his 12 disciples, I don't know what the pecking order was from 13 to 2, but Jesus was at the top of the social structure. So he's the last person who should be washing feet that night. And yet what we see here, obviously, is this idea, this reality that Jesus reduces himself. He humbles himself. He elevates the rest of the group. That's what serving does. Serving calls us to elevate others. Serving calls us to give value, to give honor to those who are around us. It causes us to humble ourselves, to divest of ourselves, and to enter into a life of elevating those around us. I don't know if this is I don't know if this is a perfect thing or not. But it's kind of like the Queen of England coming to your house and cutting your front lawn for you. It's like, the Queen shows up with her, her sensible shoes and her patent dress and her crown on. Dude, let me cut your lawn for you. And she kind of, and you look out, and there she is, personal her, Right? It's like you'd be standing at your window going, this is weird, this shouldn't be. This isn't right, something's wrong here. And that's kind of like what Jesus does. It's this juxtaposition. It's something that isn't supposed to be. It's a lesson, too, that Jesus had emphasized with his disciples. And this is just discipleship stuff, but of course it plays out in the life of family. But this is like a just part of our being in relationship. This is Jesus, like I said, the way he takes things, and there's a way that looks right on the surface of this world, but Jesus takes it and says, no, that isn't the way it works. We think about the Gospel of Mark, another scenario where Jesus is kind of teaching his disciples the upside down way of his kingdom. And I love this little section here. It's in Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. It tells us that the disciples and Jesus are walking down a road. And the disciples are having this argument. It says when they came to this place, Capernaum, when he was in the house, Jesus asked them, he says, what are you arguing about on the road? So he heard they're having some argument. And I love this. He goes, it says, but they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who is the greatest. I think that's funny. These guys, what do you guys are? Well, we had an argument about who is the greatest. Yeah, me and my friends argue about that all the time. You know, of course, I'm the greatest. No, you know, we all have this. They're arguing about who's the greatest amongst his disciples. It tells us that Jesus then takes this little child and he places it among them, and he said, whoever welcomes one of these, anyone who wants to be first, he says, must be the very last and the servant of all. He takes this child, he says, whoever welcomes one of these little ones in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. So Jesus teaches them this idea. You know, they are arguing about who's the greatest. And Jesus says, no, guys, that's not how it works. If you want to be first, if you really want to be the greatest, if you will, then you need to learn how to be the servant of all. And again, you know, very quickly, so he takes this child. He says, so for instance, if you want to show that you're in a relationship with me, you'll welcome this child. You value this child, which again to us makes you go, well, yeah, of course, that makes sense. But in the ancient world, as I said, children weren't that valued. Children were given preference, the way we often treat them in our cultures these days. So Jesus says, if you really want to show you're associated with me, you learn how to serve even the lowest, like this child. But so this is great. This is really where I love this whole thing. So a little bit later, just not that far, chapter 10 in Mark, we read this story about two of Jesus' disciples, James and John. And it says that they come to Jesus with their mom, and they ask Jesus if they can have the most powerful places when he comes into his ultimate kingdom. So James and John come, and they got their mom with them, you know, advocating. And the mom comes down there, and they're following right behind her, I guess. And they ask if they can have the corner offices in the coming kingdom. You know, Jesus, you can be president, but can we be your vice presidents in the corporate structure of the kingdom that is to come? And so Jesus again, you know, said, no, this is all wrong. And the disciples hear about this, and they're indignant, it says. They're upset because these guys come and they're asking for these places of power. And so once again, Jesus has to call them together. He calls his disciples together, and he says, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man, Jesus speaking of himself, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so this lesson that Jesus is teaching his disciples here again in this section of John in the upper room when they're the night before he's crucified is a lesson that he's taught his disciples many times before. One that they struggled to get. Now, on a certain sense, I relate to the disciples. Because this is, again, the upside-down kingdom. This is the way Jesus calls us to see the world differently. But it's not the way that's normal for me. It's not the way that's normal for most of us. We're called to come into our families, just like we're called to go into any part of our lives. And we're called to figure out how can we elevate others. How can we come in And how can we serve and offer ourselves as a servant to all? That's not my natural impulse. My natural impulse is to, like the disciples, to figure out how I can get a corner office, how I can be served. But Jesus says, no, to be great in my kingdom is to figure out how to serve others. Serving causes us to elevate others. It causes us to find ways to meet the needs of others, to help others do better, to help others be taken care of. That has massive implications for our family life. Not just for parents, but for children, for brothers, for sisters. What does it mean for you to be servant in your home, to elevate those with whom you live? Second thing we see is that serving causes us to risk rejection. Note verse 2. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And then in verse 11 we read, for Jesus says about Jesus, says, for he knew who was going to betray him. And that was why he said not everyone was clean. So what we know here at this meal, amongst this group who Jesus washes their feet, who Jesus offers this act of humble service, there's Judas. And Judas, we know, because we know the rest of the story. The story text tells us this, is that Jesus is the one who will reject. Judas, rather, is the one who will reject Jesus, who will betray Jesus. But Jesus, it tells us, washes his feet, serves him, elevates him, even though he knows that Judas will be the one who will ultimately betray him. Well, betrayal and rejection happens in families too. Sometimes in our families, our children rebel. Our children go in ways that we ourselves wouldn't want them to, or wouldn't desire them to. But they reject. They reject the teaching of the home. They reject the love of the parents. And they go their own way. Parents sometimes ignore their children. Parents sometimes behave in ways that are anything but faithful parenting. Whether it's because they are verbally abusive or physically abusive or abusive in any other kind of way. Whether they're just absentee parents who spend most of their lives working and looking after their own interests and very little with their families. Parents sometimes ignore or fail their parent, their children, their families, their spouses. Sometimes those amongst those who we serve, those who in our families who we try and elevate and do things for, don't appreciate what we do for them. One of my friends tells a story about his mom. I don't know if this is probably maybe Christmas dinner. In our culture, maybe in yours too, as you probably know, Christmas dinner is a big deal, right? And usually it's a big turkey. Is that often the case in your home too? You get to do turkey and stuff like that. So his mom, my friend Brian, did this experiment one Christmas day. And, she cooks the turkey, and she does the turkey. And those of you who do that, that's a lot of work, right? It takes forever. She took all day. She's cooking turkey, she's making vegetables, she's mashing potatoes. I don't know if she needed 2 hands. It's not that big. But anyway, she's mashing potatoes. She's doing whatever. She puts the meal all day working on Christmas Eve. And she has 2 boys, Brian and his brother and the dad. It took them 7 minutes to eat the dinner. And then there was some game on TV or something. So they ate the dinner and that was great. Let's get back to the game. And 7 minutes. And so she called him on it, right? She goes, I take all day to cook this dinner and you eat it in 7 minutes and then leave the table for her to clean it up, right? I mean, that's not being very appreciated. But we do that for families. We serve and we don't always feel appreciated. Our natural impulse is we want to protect ourselves. We don't want to, if we serve, we're risking rejection, or we're risking the idea that when we do good things, or we offer our service, even to those who don't seem to care, or maybe for those who are behaving in ways that they don't deserve to be served, we want to not feel the pain of rejection, and so we pull back on serving others. Jesus, on the other hand, switches it around. And he serves Judas, even though Judas is going to reject him in less than 24 hours. Serving invites us to risk rejection, but we do it because it's the way of Jesus. It's the way that we're called and invited to live out our followership of Jesus as those who serve our families and those around us. Because this then teaches us the third little principle here, and that is that serving calls us to sacrifice. Serving is a call to sacrifice, and that's part of what's going on here in this text. So in verse 6, it tells us that Jesus comes to Peter, and he says to him, Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Peter replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," Peter said, "you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Well, what's that all about? That seems like an odd question. Jesus says, "Well, you don't understand what I'm doing." "Well, sure we do. You're doing something radical. You're being a servant. You're taking on a servant's role and washing our feet." And Jesus goes, "No, you don't really fully understand what's going on here." Because in John's Gospel, what's actually happening here is foot washing is more than simply an act of servanthood. It's also a foreshadow of the complete washing that Jesus will offer to his disciples when he dies on the cross. And that's why he says to Peter, you got to know, if you don't let me wash you, you have no place with me. Is that Jesus being petulant, going, "Hey, if you don't let me wash your feet, then you're not my friend"? Is that what Jesus is saying? No. Much more than that. He's saying, you don't fully understand what's going on here, Peter. I'm washing your feet now, but there's a greater washing that's going to come. And you need to receive that washing so that we can be in relationship with one another. And what most commentators, scholars will say, and I think they're right, is that Jesus is saying, my washing, this washing of feet, is just a simple illustration of a greater washing that is to come. And that's the washing that Jesus offers to us. It cleanses us from sin and restores us into relationship with himself. Because that is Jesus' ultimate act of servanthood. Remember, we read just from Mark's Gospel just a few minutes ago, and he says, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The ultimate act of servanthood that Jesus offers to all of us is his sacrifice on the cross. So that as we come to him and ask for his mercy and ask for his forgiveness, his blood metaphorically covers us and cleanses us from our sins and offers us the opportunity to be restored into that intimate relationship that God has created us for. That's the ultimate act of servanthood that Jesus has offered to us. The sacrifice of himself on the cross. And we're now invited to identify with that by offering ourselves sacrificially to follow in his way, to live life in that sort of upside down way that he calls us to see the world in. Because if we receive him as Lord, then it's like this idea of saying, okay, Jesus, it's your way, not mine. Help me to understand how to live in your way. And it's often very different from the way that the world tells us to live. And servanthood is part of that. Serving calls us to sacrifice because it calls us to follow in the way of Jesus, the one who gave the ultimate sacrifice. And so when we serve, we're identifying with Jesus as we're identifying with his sacrifice. Now, let me just say this as a little thing about how that, I think, connects with family. When we live like that, we have the opportunity to create a culture. We have the opportunity to create a culture within our family, a culture of service of one to another. And look, this has great implications for those of us, no matter what role we play in a family. Hey, this is stuff, if you're a parent, and we make this commitment to be the servant of our spouse, the servant of our children, we begin to create a culture, a Jesus culture, a way of living in this world that embraces the upside-down kingdom of Jesus, that says we're here, and in family we're going to learn to serve one another. We're going to create a culture of preferring one another. If you're a son or a daughter in a family, you can begin to impact your family
by embracing the way of Jesus and entering into this life of servanthood and figuring, how can I serve my family? How can I offer myself as a servant to my family? And culture can begin to be shaped even within your family. If you're a brother or a sister, you can ask yourself, how can I serve my brother? How can I serve my sister? Wow, is that ever radical, huh? And that would really be upside down if you started to do that. But that's how cultures are created. A culture of servanthood, sacrifice, that Jesus calls us to. Well, finally, the thing we see here is that serving then also causes us to influence others. In a similar way as servanthood creates the culture of sacrifice, it also creates a potential for change to take place. So Jesus, at the end of this passage, says to his disciples, he goes, as you've seen me do, as you've received service from me, as you've seen me do this, he goes, now go do this for other people. That's the ultimate call for us to follow in the way of Jesus. It's to go and to serve others and influence others so that others will also move into this kind of upside-down kingdom that Jesus has called us to participate in. When you think of family, you have to think of in-laws as well. In-laws are interesting. Same thing. You don't choose your friends. You choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. Or you can choose your spouse, but you can't choose your in-laws. My in-laws are great. We're taping this, right? They are great. The brother-in-law and the mother and father-in-law. My mother and father-in-law actually are examples of what we're talking about here in a very real way. My mother-in-law grew up in a family where she lost her father when she was very young, and her mother got remarried to her stepfather, who was not a cruel man, not an abusive man or anything like that, but he was a man who didn't really know how to offer affection, who didn't know how to offer affirmation, who didn't know how to really nurture my mother-in-law. And her mother, too, was a fine woman. I knew her a little bit before she passed away. But it wasn't a household where there was much love that flowed. I remember last night we talked about how that's a great killer of families, lack of affection. Well, that's her story. Her brother went on, he became an alcoholic and struggled with some of the issues that family had brought upon him. And my mother-in-law came out of that background. My father-in-law grew up in a house that was radically alcoholic, both his parents. And his dad was, my father-in-law tells me stories about what his childhood was like. It's just utter physical and verbal abuse. His dad would probably be in jail today. We just don't tolerate that kind of stuff anymore. But this is years ago. He was literally, physically, emotionally abused as a kid. Well, long story short, through their lives, both my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, when they were young people, came to Jesus. And they came into a relationship with Christ. And this changed their life. And also, as they grew in their faith, brought healing into their life and measures of wholeness. But then they found each other and they got married. Now, in the real world, that's maybe got less than a 50% chance of working out well. And I don't say this to be judgmental. That's not the case. It's just the reality, right? When two people from very dysfunctional, broken families come together, the idea that, it'll all work out fine, doesn't always go that way. Oftentimes that just perpetuates dysfunction. Well, my mother and father-in-law had found Christ and were nurtured in their faith, and they came together and started a family. And that family produced a few kids, one of them being my wife, and another one being my brother-in-law, Jerry, and another brother, Daryl, who passed away when he was young. But Jerry, my brother-in-law, and his wife, and their family, they're doing well. They've established a family that, as much as we're all a little dysfunctional, they've established a family. It's on a healthy trajectory. My wife and I come together, and I don't know what to say about that, but we're doing all right. Could be worse, I guess. Not completely dysfunctional. moving in that trajectory. And, you know, I look at that and I say to myself, you know, this is the power of the upside-down kingdom of Jesus. Two people who came from completely dysfunctional families, who had every potential in this world to just kind of perpetuate some of those struggles, took on the way of Jesus, took on this idea of being servant to one another as a couple, to servant to their kids, and now there's a couple other families that are taking a different trajectory. We're not perfect, but I'm not saying that, but, you know, moving in a certain direction. Because this idea that taking on the Jesus way, when we commit ourselves to serving one another, it has an influence. It sets trajectories for lives, not just our own life, but the lives of others. It sets trajectories for the life of your spouse, when you have a spouse, if you don't have one now. It sets trajectories for your kids, whether you have kids now or will have kids in the future. It sets trajectories for your grandkids, and for your great-grandkids, and for your great-great-great-grandkids. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to turn out perfect, but it creates a culture and sets a trajectory of who are we going to be as people in this world. Are we going to live in this world in ways that are often perpetuate the ways of this world, or do we take Jesus' upside-down kingdom and say we're going to live into that with the belief that that's going to create generations to come of health and potential for the kingdom to bear fruit in this world because we choose to live as families the way that Jesus calls us to live as people who are servants to those around us. Because you see, when you choose to follow Jesus in his ways, when you choose to live as a servant in your family and in your life, the thing that happens is, and Jesus says this to his disciples, he says, now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. Why will we be blessed if we do them? Because when we live like that, we go and we act and we live and we seek to emulate, be like Jesus. What happens is that we find Jesus there. And when we seek to live as Jesus has called us to live, we experience the presence and power of Jesus in our lives. And that's why we're blessed. And that's why others are blessed as a result. So, as we come this morning, let me just close with a couple very simple questions for us to sort of mull over and pray through as we seek to respond to this in families. And this question maybe is a hard question. Maybe it's a challenging question. Maybe it's a difficult question. But let me ask you this. In your family, whose feet do you need to wash? Not literally, but whose feet do you need to wash? Who in your family needs your service? In what way can you serve in your family today or when you get back from the conference in a way that will somehow represent the intentions and life of Jesus for your family? Whose feet do you need to wash? Maybe it's more than one person. But how can you offer service in the life of your family that will bring Jesus to bear in the life of your home? And the other thing, let me ask and invite you to think about is, are you letting Jesus serve you? Because in a certain way, none of this stuff really works unless at the core of our heart, at the core of our being, we've sort of allowed Jesus to come and to serve us by washing us. By coming and washing our, not just feet, but our souls. If we're going to live for Jesus, we have to know who Jesus is. Jesus has to have residence in our life. And he makes that very available to us. It's just a matter of us taking a step of faith that recognizes our need to be forgiven, that recognizes our need to be in relationship with Jesus. And we let him serve us first. And once he's served us and begins to work in our lives, then we can follow in his way. As we do these things within the life of our families, we will be blessed because Jesus shows up in power and he changes our lives and he affects our families and he makes them live, makes them shaped according to his upside down kingdom, which he invites us into, each one of us.